Whether you operate one forklift or thousands, one location or hundreds, the new My Toyota customer portal can help you optimize your operation and material handling equipment. This one-stop, free-to-use platform is designed to help you take control of your information and make smarter decisions, all at the touch of a button. Register and access your data today at my.toyotaforklift.com. That's my.toyotaforklift.com.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. Today, I'm going to be joined with Ranga Bodla. He is the VP of Field Engagement and Marketing at Oracle's NetSuite. So we're going to talk to him a little bit about NetSuite and its supply chain component. We're also going to talk about what's been happening during the pandemic and all these kind of delays and disruptions in supply chains for manufacturers and what's been going on with overseas. And then we're going to get into a little bit of an interesting topic talking about the concept of reshoring and what exactly that means and how companies are kind of going about that, and also how companies who want to go about that can get into that. So Ranga, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm happy to be here and happy to have the conversation. This is definitely one that I think is interesting, and it's one that is definitely increased in its interest level. Particularly with the last few months. So again, thank you again for having me on, and looking forward to the conversation.
Definitely, thanks for coming on. I think it's definitely an interesting topic as well. So before we dive into that, why don't you just give us a little background on NetSuite for those that may not be familiar? And I know it covers a lot of different business components, but let's talk a little specifically about kind of the supply chain component.
Sure, happy to, Kevin. So for those that may not be familiar with NetSuite, so we actually operate as a business unit of Oracle. So NetSuite itself actually was founded in 1998. Kind of hard to believe, almost 22 years ago.
Wow.
Our founder, Evan Goldberg, founded NetSuite, and the premise was an integrated business management suite run in the cloud. So we were talking about cloud even before really cloud was something that people were even thinking about and even talking about. And I've been at NetSuite for the last 10 years or so, and we've continued to grow during that time frame. And in 2016, Oracle acquired NetSuite, and we continue to operate as part of Oracle. About 21,000 customers around the world use NetSuite, day in and day out to run their business. And it goes from everything from managing their books, their CRM, managing out the relationships with their customers. And then in particular, a big target area for us, one of the areas that we have a lot of customers, retailers, manufacturers, distributors, is the supply chain component. And so we have, our customers, use us for financials, but they also use us for inventory and demand planning, and procurement, production, and warehousing, and fulfillment. And so if you really look at our supply chain offering, it's built on native NetSuite, and it gives our customers the functionality to track and manage the product in real time, all the way from raw material, the supplier, into the customer's hands. And so, and of course it depends on the customer, but we will, some of our customers will use it, and they'll look at a product as it moves through the entire supply chain, and in real time, in terms of financial records, inventory, so that the entire organization has visibility into sales and inventory levels on hand, as well as really committed orders to suppliers. And so that's really the kind of very high level side of it. And our customers, span from very small to much larger as well. And so I think, as Kevin, that these days you can be a just a couple of people, male or female, right? You can be a couple of people and you have a great idea. You can do design. You can do design with a few people and then you outsource the rest. And that's, we have a lot of customers that use us for that. And some people that started using us when they're very small, when it was just a couple people with a great idea. And then as they grew, they added those other functions and run all that on NetSuite. So I don't know if that's a help. Hopefully that's a helpful background of the kind of company and kind of a little bit on supply chain, but I can dive into a little more detail if you'd like.
No, I think that's good. I think that's a good overview. And I like that, you pointed out there that NetSuite, is capable for a company of just a few people or, a large company as well. So I like the fact that it's something that you can start off with, like you said, like you just have an idea and you're designing something and, maybe you just start like a little e-commerce company shipping and you can start off like that. And then as you grow and you go into those growth modes that NetSuite can grow with you, you don't have to all of a sudden now look for a new platform or something. So I think that's really interesting that you guys have the versatility. And I think it's really good to know that.
Yep. It's always the fun thing. Probably one of the best parts of my job is you get to talk to these, just really interesting companies doing, everything from, whether it's, a product as crazy as different types of jerky, all the way to companies that make shoes, right? It's just very differing companies that all use NetSuite to run their business.
All right. Well, I love jerky. So if you have any jerky tips, we'll take that offline. But so we want to talk today about. We talked a little bit about the concept of reshoring and stuff, but take it a little step back. Obviously we know that the pandemic has been going on, right? Everybody knows that, I think, at this point. But what's happening in supply chain has kind of been pushed to the forefront a little bit because we've seen all the effects of delays in a supply chain and what they can have on products for the consumer. And I think the biggest example is probably toilet paper, right? Everybody went crazy for toilet paper. So, when these are starting to happen and the delays start to happen because there's things going on overseas and so much of manufacturing has been pushed overseas and then certain restrictions are put in place, which affects, the shipping times, affects the manufacturing, affects the fact that if they can even get released to ship. How do you think that this has kind of changed the thinking of where manufacturers should be located in relatively to like the marketplace or where the consumer is actually at?
It's interesting, Kevin. We've been, it's the pandemic has definitely exacerbated this issue, and right. It's brought it to the forefront. But interestingly enough, this is, this was a topic that was being talked about, even 3 or 4 years ago. And then, maybe even like 12 to 18 months ago, with a lot of these conversations about tariffs, people started to have the conversation like, are we at risk by sole sourcing? Like, I think there was a real movement towards this notion of just-in-time inventory. Like, you really just reduced what you had to carry on your books as much as possible. So because it was relatively easy to get product. So if you only had a couple of weeks of inventory, that wasn't a big deal because the market allowed for that and for you to rapidly, if changes happened, in general, you could ramp up pretty easily to get more volume if you needed it. And unfortunately, as all of us know, the pandemic and everything else that's kind of happened has really changed, I think, a lot of perspective on that. And I think it's forced people to really have some hard conversations about, well, maybe that sole sourcing strategy wasn't the best, that worked, but now it may no longer work. And we kind of don't have, there's a lot of uncertainty. And so we really need to be thinking about changing that approach. And that's I think one of the things that's really important here is this is not I outsourced everything from the US. So I was doing manufacturing primarily in Asia. And it's not like you can just snap your fingers and suddenly you change that overnight. And I think you know that very well. However, it's now that we're at this point, and I think this happened with tariffs, where people were like, maybe I need to be thinking about that for my 2 or 3 year strategy.
Yeah.
And it's almost like the pandemic has forced people to say, I'm going to accelerate some of these plans that I've been thinking about how close I'm doing my manufacturing, where I'm doing my manufacturing, where I'm doing sourcing, how many days of inventory or weeks of inventory that I'm keeping, all of those things. And I think, this crisis has really revealed a couple things. It's highlighted the need for visibility into these offshore supply chains. I don't think people really realized the fragility of the network itself. And I think people, because like as I said, a year ago, you had 2 weeks of inventory, demand went up, you could relatively easily ramp that demand up. Now that's not the case. And so I think, those weaknesses, those holes in the network have really been revealed. And I think people are looking at, how do I make sure and build more resilience into my supply chain, and thinking of that as a longer term picture? How do I improve kind of traceability, the visibility side of it, and what's there? And, kind of coming back to what I said, even a few years ago, and I say this specifically from my own experience, because I was having these conversations with some of our customers, that there's these conversations about, should I be moving pieces of my supply chain, manufacturing, sourcing, to more local regions, the US, Canada, Mexico, because maybe there's an opportunity to be more nimble, and therefore resilient when the unexpected strikes. So that's a conversation that's now being had. And I think, there's transparency is one piece, in terms of, if you have a shorter supply chain, it's obviously easier to be able to track a product. But the control piece, I think, is probably the bigger one. If you've got something that's closer to home, let's say you're a company that used to manufacture primarily in Asia, and now you're manufacturing in Mexico.
Right.
Well, relatively easy to get to Mexico. Even I'm in Illinois, but it's not. I can get to Mexico easier than I can get to China. I could actually drive there, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there is there's that control piece that I think is a big part of it. There's also the lead time piece, and this was the conversation that I think has been kind of brewing, which is this notion of if I can have a shorter lead time. Particularly if I have something that, I'm going to have smaller batches of, that shorter lead time gives me more flexibility. I can control demand and watch demand more closely, and ramp up and down demand, and still be able to get it where I need to with the right level of quality. And I think that's a big change that's there. And then even just the lower transportation costs.
Right.
Particularly right now, you don't have the same level of traffic between the U.S. and Asia that was happening. And so, costs have gone up significantly from a transport perspective. And so, if you make it in North America, you can do it by truck, you can do it by train. There's these opportunities that, don't exist, if you're primarily relying on ocean freight.
Right, definitely. I think you make some really great points there. And I think even, I like your point about it's not so easy to even get there. So if you have a problem there, and then all of a sudden there's a shutdown, right, like we had, it's, you can't even get over there to really check on what's happening. So definitely that control is an interesting aspect that you pointed out. So, when we talk about this reshoring, right, and, it's starting to come to a head, like you said, and it's kind of accelerating for some companies as, they're looking to see how can they pivot a little bit and get in a better position coming out of the pandemic, or even as the pandemic continues. So how do you think that companies really can start to sort of shift their supply chain and, become less global and more domestic, or have a better positioning, I guess, in where they're sourcing from and where they're manufacturing at?
So I think there's a couple things, and I think I do want to point this comment out again, Kevin, which is this is not an all or nothing proposition. Right. First of all, second, it's not something that you're just going to take. You just do one. You kind of snap your fingers and it's done. It's going to take some time. But that being said, there's I think it doesn't have to be all or nothing. That's first. Let's start there. Mm-hmm. You can add secondary suppliers domestically. Start using a contract manufacturer, say in Mexico or the US, to mitigate the effects. Or maybe you take certain product lines that have lower quantities and you move those domestically as a starting point. I think you can there is a growing movement as well of people that want to purchase products made locally, and they'll pay more for them. And so, if you have, but to have made in the USA or made in America as part of your tagline, doesn't mean that everything has to be made in America. I mean, obviously there's rules about what that looks like, the amount of product that has to be manufactured domestically. But it's also, it doesn't have to be all your products. And I'm not saying that, a company should be misleading. What I'm saying is, there may be certain products that you lead with that really drive product, the business, and drive that interest. And those could be made domestically. And you start there as a starting point, or, you start on the sourcing side where, you pull in certain ones and you drive that sourcing, for some of those products domestically, and you leave the rest internationally. And again, it also depends on the industry, because obviously there's infrastructure that exists in certain industries. Apparel is a good example where it's tough to move all of that and find enough suppliers for that. However, other areas like electronics, assembly, things like that, I think you have more options, and I think that's an example of where you can do things. There's also what we call as mixed models. There's not one model for localizing your supply chain. So one example of this is tolling, where a business is outsourcing the manufacturing, but then taking the final steps of the production and being onshore. And again, there's rules about how you can market and kind of refer to that, but that's an example of that. Another example is joint venture. If there are multiple companies that are already vertical manufacturers and they need the same materials or use similar manufacturing processes, they can join forces to stand up the factory or build out the capability. There's a potential PE angle to this as well, where certain PE firms are looking to bring those synergies together, where there's like companies in that context. So I think those are some of the areas when I think about kind of the reshoring piece. Again, just I want to come back to, it's not an all or nothing proposition. And companies can start that shift, and it takes time. And so companies, I think it's important for companies to be thinking about it now. As you said, whether it's coming out of the pandemic or coming through the pandemic as it continues, either way, if you do it in the right way, ultimately it's going to serve you better. It's going to reduce your risk and maximize, your ability to sell. It's not just we're doing this because it can't just be about a risk conversation. It needs to be also about what's gonna help us be more resilient.
We'll be back after a quick break.
You hear a lot about supply chains these days, because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood, and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Join me for insightful interviews with thought leaders and industry experts. We discuss how optimizing supply chains can break down the barriers that are holding businesses back. That's All Business, No Boundaries by DHL Supply Chain. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Definitely, yeah. And I think, resiliency is key coming out of the pandemic or even surviving through the pandemic. So it's important that companies start to look at how can they prepare if something like this happens again. Hopefully it doesn't, but you don't want to be put in a position where you're not prepared. So I like that you're talking about the flexibility, being flexible, and talking about the different aspects, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It can just be one part and test it out. And I like the idea too that you're talking about where you have to be creative in the sense of, what can you look that's where it's already existing, maybe domestically, right? Can you repurpose some kind of manufacturing to help you out, or even look into joint ventures like you mentioned? So I think that's pretty interesting. And I think through the pandemic overall, through business, I think people are looking at things in that way, and they're definitely increasing the flexibility in their business and how do they operate. I mean, even if you look at just restaurants that pivoted from, never doing takeout or delivery or anything like that, and now they're utilizing technology to be able to just kind of keep their business alive through still offering that service. So it's a really, really interesting time. Obviously, it's not a nice time. It's a bit of a dark time, but from that, I think is coming a lot of opportunity and a lot of rethinking of how we do business and how the consumer operates too as well. So you mentioned in there, increasing resiliency, but I'm curious, what are some of the risks of reshoring, right? We talk about reshoring as a sense of creating more resiliency, but obviously with everything, there are some risks as well. So what do you see are some risks, and how can you kind of avoid them or maybe prepare yourself as you start to maybe move some components of your business around?
Yeah, so that's a really important one. And let's start with, one that oftentimes comes up: cost. I think the cost piece of this is one where people say, how could I possibly if it costs me, $10, per piece over in China, say, for example,
Right.
There's no way I can replicate that in the US or Mexico. And the reality is the cost of onshore suppliers and manufacturers will often be higher than what companies find offshore. That is true. Yeah. However, I think there's a couple things that can be done. I don't think it's the same as something you may have done, if you had done a certain process or a certain way, or there's a certain amount of labor involved, human labor involved, physical labor. Automation is one area. And you're seeing a lot of that as a way. So if it took you 10 people to do something overseas, using a combination of automation and some other things, you do it with 2 people. So you do it with less people. There are some approaches that I've seen there.
Right.
Automated material handling, packaging, things like that. And there's equipment that you're seeing this in the robotics world where there's some of these things that are on the hard goods part, where it's easier to do that. Now, apparel, again, I know is one that's a little bit more challenging, but even there, I think you're seeing the emergence of some of these areas that I think are there, and I think it's what one thing I hear is it is going to be higher costs at on the surface, but there's also the quality side of things where I'm throwing away less or maybe wasting less than I might have been if I was using it overseas. So that's one area. Right. The second is finding qualified labor, and in some of these sectors, it's almost impossible to match the expertise of what you can find elsewhere. But we're seeing things in Mexico. I think now it's a very promising alternative for many manufacturers. Across a number of sectors: aerospace, automotive, electronics, appliances, furniture. And I think there's they're growing that base as well. I mean, they're growing what they're doing there, and that, that's, I think, as more companies look to that, you're going to see more opportunity there as well.
Right.
And then I think the last piece, which I'll bring up, is just really scaling the business. Some industries are going to be better suited for reshoring than others. And so, some countries, may not be able to support the needs of certain industries that went almost entirely offshore. There's certain raw materials or subcomponents that can't be found in other countries.
Yeah.
That's a tricky one. The raw materials one in particular, particularly say rare earth type minerals, things like that. That's one that gets a little trickier.
Yeah.
But organizations that make essential products, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, PPE, construction materials, they have a stronger case for coming back because there is a little bit of that made in America element that's there. There's a quality element that's there, and I think there's also there's, as a country, we're investing more in those things. We're recognizing the risk of having all of our pharmaceuticals not necessarily being produced here and completely reliant on other countries. And so, there's a push to pull some of those back because, they're essential. Right. And particularly in a pandemic, if you're shutting everything down, you got to bring some of those things back, if you want to be in a better risk position. So I think that's, and some of these industries are going to be better than others. But those are the risks as I see them, and some of the ways to mitigate them.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you pointed out the PPE, because it was interesting to see how some companies here in America, right, they kind of pivoted and never made PPE before, right? And then all of a sudden they turned their manufacturing lines into making PPE, so that it was domestically produced. So it's pretty interesting to see, how these companies are kind of being flexible and how they're also kind of helping out with mitigating the risk of society overall, let alone their own risk as a business, right? And so it'd be interesting as companies start to do this, how, we see the world, I guess, change a little bit. And I think, one of the things that's, obviously happened with the internet and just kind of global supply chain and global expansion is that the world essentially became smaller, right? So, do you think the pandemic and with the kind of trend or the idea of reshoring in a sense and bringing things more domestic, do you think the world will then become larger in a sense as opposed to how it became smaller?
Do you meaning will people? Yeah, I mean, I think the labor pool and the skill gap are considerations. So one of the things is there was a mass exodus of manufacturers from the U.S.
Right.
And that drained the labor pool, and so the workforce developed more technical skills, and some of that's going to those are considerations that are going to have to change. The skilled labor pool is going to need to be restored to accommodate the number of companies that could potentially localize. I think that's an opportunity. And it's going to be really a factor in how many localize them for good. I think what you're going to see too is, and you made a really good point about the PPE, coming back to that. And we saw a ton of our customers actually making that move where, they saw they changed their business, starting producing PPE as a short-term thing at the beginning. But then what ended up happening was it was almost like it really expanded their business and gave them an opportunity that they weren't expecting to have. And so I think that's what's really interesting about this, is that I think all these changes, you're going to see those, if companies are looking at that, they're going to want to keep that. And so I think, hopefully that will continue to grow. And, now there's a labor pool that's there. So it's kind of becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Like I can't relocate because there's no labor to do it.
Yeah.
But if the labor exists, then, more people are doing it, and then it just sort of starts to grow on itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my hope. I really think that as as they grow the labor force locally or domestically, I should say, that we're going to see more opportunities in that regard. I think that's going to be something that I think will hopefully evolve. And I think, we'll be the North America, or at least the U.S. in particular, will be in a stronger position because of it.
Interesting. Yeah. It's a pretty interesting perspective, and it'll be really interesting to see, I guess, the long-term impact on just everything overall with this pandemic. I mean, it's been crazy, and it's been very sudden too, which I think is the wild part about it. So it'll be interesting to see how we come out of it, I guess, on a global perspective, but also on the domestic perspective as well overall. So really, really interesting topic and insights from you, Ranga. So I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us. How can people find out more information about NetSuite?
Our website's the best place, is what I always recommend.
Okay.
NetSuite.com. We got a ton of resources up there. We have a number of places on there. There are some industry pages as well. So if people have questions around distribution or manufacturing or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
there are some specific industry pages. But usually I say NetSuite.com is a great place to start. We're constantly doing a number of different topics, whether it's talking about inventory or public funding or any number of things. The thing that people, if they don't know NetSuite, will find that's very different about us is because we're one platform that run all these companies. We have software companies and we have manufacturing companies all running the same software, and so we get some really interesting insights from our customers. So that's the best place to go, and there's a lot of information up there that I would definitely point people to.
Okay, great. And we'll definitely post all that information on the newwarehouse.com as well. So Ranga, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more content from the New Warehouse, check out our new video series called All Hands on LinkedIn. Just search for the New Warehouse on LinkedIn and follow along.